Hello everyone, welcome to CPSC 150, Introduction to Programming in Python. Uh, this is Dr. Mohammed Almalag, and this is going to be our first lecture on Python. First, we're going to look at what is Python. In this video, we will talk about two topics. We're going to talk about Python programming language, and the main thing also we're going to talk about what is the interpreter and the compiler when it comes to programming languages. Now let's talk about Python. Python is an example of high-level programming language. What do we mean by high-level programming languages? We can put the programming languages in two different categories. We can put them in high-level programming languages and low-level programming languages. High-level programming languages that are the programming languages that are easier for the human to read the code. In this case, that if you see a program and you see a script and the code written in this programming language, you will be able to read it. Probably will make sense to you as a human. However, these programming languages, the high-level programming languages, are more difficult to the machine to read, makes it harder to the machine to read. In the low-level programming languages, when you take a look at the code and you try to read the program by yourself, you will see a lot of samples that does not make sense to you as a human. However, this kind of difficulties makes it easier for the machine. It's going to be closer to the machine language, and that we call them low-level programming languages. There's another example of high-level programming languages. You probably heard of Java or used Java before, and C and C++. These are considered to be high-level programming languages. It's easier for us to learn, easier for us to remember the code, easier for us to program with these programming languages. However, it takes more time for when we run these programs. It's going to take more time for the machine to execute it. We also can put the programming languages in two different categories as well. We have something we call them interpreter programming languages, and we have something called compiler programming languages. We're going to talk about more about these two different types of programming languages, and we will see where the Python fits into these two categories. So now let's talk about the interpreter and the compiler. The interpreters and the compilers are very similar actually in the structure. So when you write the program or the source code, they could be very similar in terms of the structure of the program. If you have some type of repetition, if you have some type of conditions, if you have some type of classes or object, they are very similar. The only difference between them is in the way they are executed. So the compiler programming languages, they have an extra step compared to the interpreter. So as you can see from this diagram, both types, they have the source code. Both types also produce the same output. Okay. The only difference between the interpreter and the compiler is in the middle between having the source code and having the output. Okay. Same thing with the interpreter. The only difference between them is in the area what the interpreter does. So let's take a look at the compiler first. If you used Java before or C or C++, you're probably familiar with the compiler and the way it works. So you start with the code or the source code that you have, then you run the compiler. Okay, you get the source code, which is the program that you wrote yourself. What the compiler is going to do is going to translate the entire program before you execute any command in this program. It's going to translate entire thing into a machine code. And after that, it's going to also, during the compiler, it's going to check for all the syntax, if you have any syntax error in the program. And it's going to translate the entire thing to a machine code. After that, you have to perform an extra step to execute it and produce the output. So this is the compiler. The interpreter is basically you have the entire program written and it's going to execute line by line from your source code in the fly. Basically, what the compiler is going to do is going to take the first line, use it in the interpreter, and then produce the output. And then takes the second line. What the interpreter is going to do is going to interpret it and produce the output, and so on and so forth. If you find an error over here, or if the interpreter finds an error over here, your program is going to produce some of the output all the way until you get to the error, and then it's going to tell you there's an error. Well, the compiler is going to make sure everything is correct and everything, for example, no syntax error, before it starts to produce any output. Where Python fits into. Python actually is an interpreter programming language. So that being said, we write the code into the interpreter line by line, and then we hit return, and then the interpreter is going to give us back a feedback or the output, and so on and so forth. Or we can write the entire program or the entire commands that we have into a file, as we usually do in, for example, Java or C++, and then pass it to the interpreter and then execute the entire program. These are two different type of modes, we call them, when it comes to interpreter languages. We have the interactive mode and we have the script mode, and we're going to try them during this semester. First, we're going to try the interactive mode, and this is usually we do it with idle, with the interpreter directly. So you write a command, and then the program or the interpreter is going to respond or give you the output, and then you type another command, and so on and so forth. While the script mode is basically you write all the commands you have, and that's when we do the programs. When we write programs, we write them in a script mode. You write the entire program, you save it in a file, and then you run it. And when you save it in a file, you save it with the extension .py. So the Python programming language is an interpreter programming language. When it comes to programming in general, programs have main parts, or you will see a lot of programs, they have all these parts. Some of them you find them have some of these parts, but these parts we're going to talk about them and we're going to see them as we go during this semester. We have input. Each program, or most programs, they will require you to have an input. What is the input going to do? What is the input coming from? It's something can be entered by a keyboard, or something the program is going to read from a file, or could be from a mic, the one I'm using right now. This is type of an input, or could be something from a scanner. You scan at the grocery store when you check out. That's also a way of getting data into your program. We also have an output. Output basically is displaying, either it's going to be on a screen, or it's going to be in a file, or could be, for example, in a receipt, or could be in a speaker. Anything the program is going to output could be a different format. And also, most programs will perform some type of math. This math is kind of going to be sometimes basic operations, sometimes going to be advanced operations. All these type of things will be added together. It's usually addition or multiplication or division or subtraction, and then to work on your input to be able to produce the output. We also have in programs, most programs, you will have conditional executions. What does that mean? You will have in your program, that means that you will have in your program certain areas in the program where you will check a certain condition, and based on the result of that condition, your program might take different route. And we're going to learn that actually in chapter 4. And we have repetition. Some programs, they have repetition. So what do we mean by repetition? Well, you will notice that some programs, they have to perform certain tasks over and over and over. So and be able to make the program to perform that, we will enter something, we call it a loop. So you can repeat the code instead of typing it over and over and over. We will also see that later on in this semester. So that's it about the first video, and we're going to continue with some other videos.